Scent by Dege the Mighty. Ponyville could not have asked for a better nightmare night. With the appearance of Princess Luna, to the sheer amount of joy she brought the young fillies and colts, Big Macintosh couldn't be happier. His only regret was not to be able to meet the princess in person. His cart ride duties had taken up his entire night, and while he won't deny he liked the attention some of the mares were giving him, he did wish he could have seen little Apple Bloom running around in her costume. He sincerely hoped Applejack would stop her from eating a lot of candy. His cart was starting to get a little heavier with each trip. He had reached the end of the route and decided to call it quits for the night.
Sorry, girls, but ride's over.
A few disappointed groans came from his passengers before they disembarked. Big Mac unhitched the cart from himself. As he cantered alongside the group to reunite with the rest of the festivities, a strange scent seemed to drift by.
Hey, Big Mac, have any plans for the rest of the night?
Nurse Redheart asked. Her question was indeed innocent given her tone. The other mares giggled amongst themselves, hearing a devious undertone that wasn't really there. Big Mac looked over at the other mares, raising an eyebrow. Raindrops and Cherryberry looked away innocently, while Cloudkicker challenged the stare.
Well, first, I need to find my sister,
he said dismissively, turning his attention to the direction of the rest of the town, all gathered around the games and talking with the Princess of the Night. Big Mac had made a mental note to introduce himself before night's end, as the six of them made their way back into town. It wasn't long before the group went on their merry way, leaving just Big Mac and Redheart in search of the rest of the Apple family. Ponyville was quite alive in the dark, with festive lanterns littering the town from rooftop to street corner. Eager fillies and colts dashed from one door to another, hoping the ponies were still home and not already at the festival itself. Princess Luna was in sight, as well as the mass of ponies she had gathered. Now in the town proper, the red stallion basked in the scent of the multitude of sweets and the occasional perfume that dressed a passing mare. As they absorbed into the crowd, Big Mac caught sight of the scarecrow his sister was disguised as.
Applejack,
he called. The orange mare turned her head away from the apple bobbing tub before trotting up to him.
Howdy, Mac. Your cart ride's over?
Yup.
Big Mac looked to either side of his sister.
Where's Apple Bloom?
She's with her friends. Pinkie Pie was leading a herd of foals all through town.
Big Mac looked at her incredulously.
Where are they now?
Applejack bumped her hoof into his side.
Oh, don't be so paranoid, Mac. They're fine. The only thing she needs to worry about is an upset tummy.
Big Mac whipped his head around. That strange smell again. But it left as soon as it came.
Did you smell that?
Smell what?
Redheart asked, reappearing out of the crowd. Big Mac unconsciously took another sniff, and the smell of sweets returned.
Well, howdy, Nurse Redheart. I'm liking the pirate outfit,
Applejack complimented.
Why, thank you, Applejack. Your scarecrow actually looks rather comfy.
Straw can feel real nice if you pike it up tight,
Applejack stated, idly pressing against the puff on her chest.
Do you mind if I borrow your brother for a second?
Redheart suddenly asked, before she began cantering away, not waiting for an answer. Raising his eyebrows at his sister in confusion, Big Mac opted to follow her. The nurse and farmer found themselves somewhat secluded from the rest of the crowd.
Listen, Mac, about the other day...
Redheart started, hoping he would catch the hint. Big Mac was distracted, his nose raised to the air before he came crashing back down to earth.
What? Oh yeah. Look, Miss Redheart. Think nothing of it. It was a mistake. No harm done.
Does it have to be a mistake?
She mumbled to herself, looking away from him. Big Mac continued to scan the town for Pinkie Pie and whatever little group she was leading. There were plenty of ponies up and about. He saw Raindrops chatting with Cloudkicker near the punch, Carrot Top and others chatting with the princess, and Ditsy Doo trying to land a spider on the web. Caramel was having fun with Cherryberry at the dance. Raindrops was cantering slowly towards the edge of town, and the cakes were trying their best at the pumpkin catapult. Still, there was no sign of his little sister anywhere.
Is everything all right, Mac?
Red Heart finally asked, seeming rather sheepish all of a sudden.
Yeah, I just need to find Apple Bloom,
Big Mac stated as he began cantering towards the stage. Red Heart was close behind him.
You really care about her, don't you?
Of course. She's practically my...
Big Mac halted his words as he caught a glimpse of Cheerilee galloping towards Applejack. Concern and fear took him over.
That can't be good. Come on!
The two of them raced back to his sister. As they drew closer, Mac could hear shortened breaths and whimpering. Cheerilee was speaking frantically to Applejack. Big Mac noticed the Cutie Mark Crusaders right next to her, and paranoia escalated with the absence of Apple Bloom.
What's going on?
He shouted, finally upon the group.
We can't find Apple Bloom, Cheerilee cried. Go on, girls. Tell him what you told me.
Scootley was the one who spoke up.
We were with Pinkie Pie, making our last rounds around Ponyville. There were only a few of us left once Pipsqueak had gone to bed. Pinkie was leading us back to town when...
Sweetie Belle interrupted.
When we started smelling this weird smell. It smelled kinda like...
Big Mac froze as a shiver cascaded down the length of his spine.
Like burned hair.
Yes, like some pony accidentally burned their mane or something.
Sweetie shouted.
When Cheerilee came to pick us up, we noticed Apple Bloom was gone.
Scootaloo finished. Overwhelming panic enveloped the red stallion, and he could see it was consuming Applejack as well.
Where were you guys when Cheerilee picked you up?
Applejack asked, speaking 1,000 words a minute.
We were near Fluttershy's cottage,
Cheerilee stated, trying her best to keep herself calm. Fluttershy's cottage, near the Everfree Forest. The mere thought shook Big Mac to his core.
We need to go. Now.
Red Heart stepped in.
I'm coming with. If she's hurt...
Don't even finish that sentence,
Mac said, with a rather more threatening tone than the words warranted. Without another word, the group quickly galloped off in the direction of Fluttershy's isolated home. Big Mac's heart raced as he led the mares and fillies away from the town, the night getting increasingly darker. Glancing at the night sky, Big Mac noted tonight was a new moon. Maybe that's why she could be here, he mused. No moon to raise. The thought only distracted him slightly, and his nose was caressed by the scent of a singed mane. The distressed group came upon the cottage like a train, almost trampling the ground beneath their hooves. As they came upon the door, Big Mac stepped aside to let Applejack knock, deciding the face of a friend would ease Fluttershy. Out of the corner of his eye, Big Mac spotted the yellow Pegasus in question, trotting in a field in the distance, in the direction of Sweet Apple Acres. Without a word, he charged, galloping off in search of answers he hoped Fluttershy would have.
Hi, Mayak!
Applejack shouted.
Where are you going?
The group's attention was diverted from the stallion, as Fluttershy slowly opened the door. Mac's muzzle was assaulted by the odd odour, almost in full force as he approached the yellow Pegasus. He noticed it had changed. The smell of burning hair was now mixed with some other strange scent, something akin to blood. He was only a short ways away from her as she passed under the shadow of a tree. He was almost directly upon her as the odour grew stronger and stronger, starting to burn his eyes. The shade from the tree had covered the Pegasus entirely as she limped her way across the field. Big Mac opened his mouth to speak, but the stench grew almost palpable. His stomach threatened to vomit. It was impossible to see under the shade as he outreached his hoof to the very faint line of her frame. His hoof met nothing but air as his eyes cleared. The odour had vanished, as had the timid mare. He shifted his gaze before trotting around the trees a few times to ensure she wasn't hiding somewhere. But Fluttershy was nowhere to be found.
Macintosh!
He heard Applejack call from afar. Turning to face them, he could make out the shapes of the three mares. Applejack quickly pulled her brother into a hug as Cheerilee and Red Heart came to a stop.
Why did y'all just run off like that?
Big Mac struggled to find the words as he tried to piece together what he'd just seen.
We found Apple Bloom.
Redheart said, obviously relieved.
She went to Fluttershy's when she got lost.
Big Mac's sigh seemed to shake the earth for the mares. The tension in his body still tightened, absolutely confused with what he saw. His fear continued to climb the longer he stood there.
It's very late. Fluttershy is letting us spend the night at her place,
Cheerily said, as she began to trot back to the cottage. Big Mac followed on strangely shaking hooves. The stallion followed the 4 mares in shock. There was no real way he could wrap his head around it. Even thinking that his mind was simply playing tricks with him didn't seem a satisfying answer. Fluttershy had been there, and then she had not. The smell had nearly made him pass out, and then it had vanished. What had happened? He was broken from his terrified thinking by the sight of the cottage. The group strode inside and came across Fluttershy setting up makeshift beds for everyone. Scootaloo, Sweetiebelle, and, thankfully, Apple Bloom were fast asleep on the couch, curled into little balls of fur. Big Mac was absolutely exhausted, more mentally than anything else. With a final good night, Fluttershy, whole and unlimping, left the group as she went upstairs. All Big Mac needed was a corner to rest his head on. The mares decided where to rest for the remainder of the evening. Applejack slept with the fillies, Cheerilee slept next to the table, and Redheart opted to sleep next to Big Mac himself. He sighed. Everything was fine now. It had all been some kind of mental trick, probably brought on by stress and worry for his sister. Everyone was safe and sound, and he could finally put this rather disturbing night behind him. Mac woke in a jolt. Rubbing his eyes, he could feel Redheart's breath on his shoulder. He took a look outside, seeing it was just before Celestia's dawn. He unconsciously began to survey the room. Applejack still rested with all 3 fillies next to the couch. Redheart rested herself against him, and Cheerilee was sharing her blanket with Berry Punch. His eyes began to close once more, as sleep wished him back home. Everything was perfectly... Big Mac's gaze shot towards Berry Punch, her back to him. In the dim light of the dawn, she looked almost yellow. Big Mac's breath began to shake as she lifted her head, turning her gaze towards him. He suddenly became aware of the scent of burning hair. Thud by Billy Morph. The door was solid steel and streaked with dried blood. Deep dents peppered its lower half, each the same semicircle the size of a pony's hoof. It clung to its hinges, immobile, a stubborn barrier designed to withstand the worst a human could throw at it. Light spilled out from under the warped frame, the single source of illumination for the tiny prison cell. The cell itself was a typical design, and could have been built anywhere in the world. A concrete cube with a single bed, sheets not included, a steel toilet with no accessible parts, and a sink with special rounded tap. There was no window. There was just a single broken light and a lone door that led to the outside world. Before the bloodied door, a pony stood. He was a strange specimen, far too small to be a real horse, The stallion had a deep blue coat. Muscles rippled down his flank as he lashed out with both hooves, slamming into the door with a powerful buck. Blood stained the ground beneath his hind legs, trickling down from the cracks in his hooves, yet he showed no signs of pain. His name was Michael, or maybe that was just a stolen memory. He certainly didn't remember being born as a miniature horse, and it wasn't like turning into a pony was a normal thing to happen to a human. People didn't get their pony license on their 16th birthday. They weren't allowed to change on their 21st. It was ludicrous, insane, laughable. Michael was still a pony, though. It was funny how little common sense affected reality. The cell was far more familiar than his new form. Michael didn't have a problem with drinking. He was quite good at it. The consequences of drinking tended to bite him in the arse, though. Still, sometimes it was easier to deal with a crappy week by obliterating a Friday night than trying to solve problems at the office. He knew his limits. He wasn't hurting anyone. He wasn't like his dad, who had a home and a kid to screw up. So what if Michael ended up in the drunk tank on occasion? That was his right. It never hurt anyone.
Dark!
Blood continued to seep from his hooves as he bucked the door. He didn't even have to think about the motion anymore. He'd come a long way from his first, hesitant, stumbling steps. His hooves blurred as he lashed out at the door, the impact echoing through the tiny room. There was no sign of the panicked human in the wrong shape anymore, just grim, equine determination.
Dark!
Michael had thought he'd crossed a limit when he'd first woken with hooves. He'd never touched anything illegal before, that wasn't his poison, and it wasn't like he had the money to have those kinds of habits. The comforting thought that it was just an acid trip hadn't lasted long, though. Acid wore off after a few hours, and it had been days, or maybe a week. It was hard to tell. The only time the light had changed was when he'd broken the lamp. He'd been near inconsolable that first hour, screaming, kicking, raging at the door which kept him trapped in this tiny cell. That fire had burned its way out pretty quickly. It's hard to rage against silence, and Michael had never been a dedicated man. Screams had turned into tears, tears to please. Eventually, there had been only silence and his own ragged breathing. There are few times in a man's life when he is truly alone. So Michael waited. There must have been some agency to his predicament. There must have been. It wasn't logical for a 30-something male to turn into a pony for no reason. It was an experiment, or a hallucination, or some strange dream. But help would come. Be it coma or catastrophe, someone always came to help. His conditions weren't awful after all. He had a bed, and a toilet, and drinking water once he'd figured out how to grip the awful smooth taps with his lips. The room stayed warm and dry, and the light kept burning. Michael could endure such conditions until help came. Help never came, of course. There had been no scowling jailers, no friendly doctors. There had been not a sound through the solid steel of the door, no matter how hard Michael had strained for even a whisper. He would have killed to hear the familiar tread of boots on concrete rather than the alien clop of his hooves. There had been no food either. He didn't know just what a pony ate, but he doubted it was water alone. It was strange what hunger did to a mind after a while. Little things began to grate. The fact the whitewashed walls had not taken their coat evenly. The slight lump in the mattress. The way his tail would scratch against the plastic coating. The infernal buzz of the halogen bulb that built to a crescendo until the pony was screaming in rage at the incandescent tormentor. He'd smashed the bulb in the end. It was an insane thing to do, plunging him into the twilight gloom that had been his only companion since. For his own sake, at least light kept leaking in through the cracks in the door, or else he feared the madness would have kept its grip on him. Not that the berserk fury that gripped him truly left. It warped upon seeing the shards of glass twinkling in the half-light. Michael had scooped one of the larger shards up on his hoof and stared, for a long while, at the cutting edge. It would have been easy. It would have been logical. It would have been sweet and spiteful end. When they came back for him, for they had to eventually, they would find nothing but a useless corpse. Perhaps it was a petty vengeance, a paltry revenge for costing him his form, his life, and his hope. It would have been his choice, though, one final act before he went the way of his father. Michael's hooves smashed into the door. He stood there, panting, his sides heaving as he stared at a spot of blood on the far wall. His hooves were agony. An empty pit had opened in his stomach, and it was clawing at his insides. His mouth was dry, and his vision swam. Part of him still wished he had the glass. It would have been swift, at least, rather than dying by inches. But Michael figured he would have botched it. He'd botched everything else. Maybe he had done it. Michael was in enough pain to believe he was in purgatory. His dad being right about that would have been too much irony to stomach, though, so he soldiered on. Life was all about survival in the end. Whether his form was a fever dream or some twisted machination of an alien mind, he refused to lie down and die. The glass shards had vanished down the toilet. It had been the wrong choice, but the one he was stuck with. Ironically, the water had stopped just a little while later. The dents became deeper and deeper with each strike. A little more light crept through. Freedom came a millimeter closer. Michael had not really considered what was going on beyond his four walls. He'd clung to the belief that someone was out there. Someone was coming to help, or at least bring a change to the monotony of his imprisonment. The water failing had been the final straw, however. Water didn't fail. Power flickered, servers dropped, and cars failed to start, but the water always kept flowing. It had been a slow realization, but one long overdue. There was no one coming to save him. He had to save himself. And so he did. Just stood there and started kicking. Something would fail eventually, be it steel or flesh. Michael intended it to be steel. There was no other option, really. Rescue wasn't coming. The water was gone. Even the scraps in the toilet bowl. Survival boiled down to kicking a door. Michael would succeed at that. Or die trying.
Teleportation is just a flash, I once thought. Pop, poof, and you're there. I should be able to forgive myself for thinking that. But I can't. I can't forgive any of myselves for being so fundamentally wrong. There are more of me now, in this magical nowhere. Over my time as an Alicorn princess, I learned to focus my magic to preserve my body in the absence of the normal conditions for life, and I learned to shield my mind against insanity. My survival time here is now measured in months instead of days. I teleport a lot in months. Not nearly so much as I used to, but still a lot. And my magic works here now. Just. So the multeity of myself, occasionally reinforced, occasionally culled, We work here. We work to prevent ourselves. It makes sense. Our mission is to prevent Twilight Sparkle from teleporting again so no pony else is stuck in this hellscape. I'm always squeamish about using my corpses as supplies at first. I wear myself down eventually. Always have. Hopefully, eventually, won't have to. Might not have to. The wrong way. I call myself over to the segment of spherical shell that serves as a staging point for computation for the moment. I study my work with growing ice in my veins. Figuratively, fortunately. I'd always held out hope that it was conical, or n greater than 3-dimensional, or some other way unbounded. No such luck. My latest spell, acquired from my latest remnant, confirms it. This sphere is finite. There is no today. But today, I pulled myself back. I had a bright idea a while back. Go deeper. Teleport across the sphere. Teleportation erases tracking spells. I wonder why. Several of me have arrived with magical trackers. I reapplied one to me and I teleported. I arrived and I searched for me. I never found myself. Another attempt, with the strongest tracker I knew, then the most dedicated magical search I've ever heard of. I have all the time in the world. I felt myself. Dead. Suicide. Again, this time with an expectation of search time. This time I came back alive, and with a report. Written in my own leather and ink, of course. Another sphere. Still occupied by the first scout's corpse and the second's final scrawlings. Slightly smaller. There is but one logical course of action. I live longer and am useful for longer, and reinforcements continue to arrive. I know all I can about this sphere and the next one. There is another beyond, so multiety squared. I spread across the universes, my little universes. All I know. I travel down the stack by teleporting. The only way up is to be pulled. I scrawl messages. I light signal flares. I try to send information up the chain with the hope that I can apply it to send information beyond the chain. Chicken and egg. Information flow needs a connection. A connection out needs information flow. Interception never works. I teleport less now. Better with wings, I guess. I walk across the carpet of fur and the floorboards of bone to the wall. I measure it. Vertical. Halfway. Reinforcements appear halfway between the level of bodies and the apex. Much of my time is spent moving gruesome beacons to change my spawn point. Different twilights in different areas break down at subtly different times. It's always a downer when I go insane before touching the floor. More so because it was clearly a downer before I teleported away from it. My council approves drastic measures. The chain stretches further until I find myself in a deep sphere barely big enough to hold me. I follow myself. I never arrive. If there is no room in the sphere, the next twilight fails to materialize at origin, destination, or intermediate containment. Twilights could be created or relocated. Now they can be destroyed too. 3/4. 3/4 of this sphere is full of my bodies. I have a microcosm of civilization here. Bakeries, factories, universities, hospitals. No graveyards. All built for myself. Perfect recycling. I don't know whether to laugh or cry. But the only way to stop the madness is to fill the universe. So every few thousand of me, I build a new level, construct new buildings, and fill in the old with what's left of me after I'm done with it. Waste not, want not. I have made a discovery. One that won't save us, or Twilight, but might save every pony after. If a sphere is full, the teleportee is destroyed. That was known. If a sphere is so very close to full, a small object near the top can be displaced to the teleport origin to make room. That was unknown. The Twilight Council has commissioned the report on the negative effects of teleportation on teleporters. I can jump halfway to the apex from this layer of dead me. There are no more smaller spheres to go to. They're all full. The universities are buried. The Twilight Council no longer meets. When one Twilight appears, the oldest must seppuku. There is only so much. The report is being edited for its 50th draft. Appendix A contains a complete accounting of every pony, every one, who's ever died here, and their cause of death. Appendix B contains a complete history of us. It's a good thing I'm here and not, say, Rainbow Dash. Bless her mortal soul, wherever it is now. I can jump and hit my head. Not my horn, my head on the apex. There's room for less than 100 more. The report is in final copy editing. I am the second last. Every pony else is dead. There's room for only one more Twilight in this largest of spheres. To swap her in, the report I've just signed, stamped, and scrawled a warning on must be swapped out. I can only hope.
Princess Twilight!
Starlight, how often must I remind you not to call me princess? We are equals! And what causes you to disturb me now? You don't usually enter here, or anywhere with this level of haste.
You've got to read this! It appeared at your last teleport origin.
A report on the negative effects of teleportation on teleporters. Dear Princess Twilight, if you teleport ever again, you will die. There is nothing any pony can do to prevent this. Now that I have your attention, this is the last will and testament of the Twilight Council of Twilight's intermediary sphere. It details the consequences of teleportation. Chief amongst these consequences is that teleportation causes a copy of the teleporter to be created and arrive at the origin. The original of the teleporter is simply left in a spherical space of indeterminate construction embedded within the astral plane. Every time you've teleported, you've condemned a copy of yourself to death. There is now no more room for copies. If you teleport again, you will not materialize anywhere. The enclosed 300 pages are the abstract of this report. Use your tome expansion spell to access the 12,500-page executive summary. Use it again to access the 205,000-page full report. And please, ban teleportation. It's not just you. Any teleport by any living being does this. Twilight Sparkle, Acting Chair of the Twilight Council, et al. Starlight, please tell Sharpquill to clear my schedule. Alternate ending. Sharpquill? Where's Twilight?
She left just a minute ago.
Did she teleport?
Yes? Oh, Celestia.
No, I don't think even Celestia could fix this.
How Cold is the Sun? By Dege the Mighty. The roar of the blizzard deafened the two of them, the snow pelting their coats with the force of arrows and the ferocity of a predator. The white flakes were nothing like the special symbol of the coldest season, an indicator to the fun times and wonderful holidays ahead. These flakes had malice behind them, a grim apathy towards life and nature. The two stallions struggled to move through the deep white ocean that had consumed their entire world. Their vision was all but destroyed in the eternal winter. The only source of light hung like a body from a noose. Celestia's sun no longer belonged to her. The blackened mass limped across the horizon, encompassed by a halo of light that served to remind them of their failure. The snow reflected what little light remained as the two ponies tried desperately to stay warm and alive among the mass devastation that surrounded them. Shining armor and Flash Sentry were almost at the meeting point. A large metal mass stood resilient against the white oppressor. Shining recognized the small structure. He spoke up to his companion, voice muffled into obscurity by the winter.
We're here. How do you know?
The Pegasus asked him, visibly shaken from the frost.
There.
The unicorn extended a hoof towards the mess.
That's Canterlot Castle. Or what's left of it.
Okay, now what?
A massive crash of thunder devastated the clouds above them, as the snow seemed to pick up its aggressive onslaught. As much as the two stallions tried to keep any snow off of them, another layer quickly built up. It had a bite to it, not unlike a parasitic insect upon their coats.
Hello, you two.
A voice boomed, easily slithering around and through the snow. The two of them turned around, facing the blackened sun, and the figure that eclipsed it. There he stood, a giant figure of ash grey. The tip of his horn as red as the fire in his eyes. The feathers of his shadowy wings as black as his smoke-mimicking mane. The alicorn peered through crimson irises, surrounded by black and the purple mist that snaked from his sockets. The towering figure of Sombra dwarfed them by comparison. Shining cursed as the alicorn's gaze fell upon him first.
It's been a while, old friend.
Flash shifted his shaking sight towards his friend, attempting to coax any sort of order from his superior. His eyes were only met with terror.
Now, would you care to tell me what you two are doing in my empire?
He asked, his quaking voice betraying the casual demeanor of his words.
And not buried in the snow with the rest of the corpses?
Shining, what do we do?
We need to hold him off until they get here.
Shining ordered, his friend visibly tensing.
Hold him off from what?
Us.
Shining shouted, before unsheathing his sword. Sombra didn't wait for the next move, as spires of obsidian erupted from the whitened earth. The two stallions narrowly evaded the first volley, the thick snow beneath their hooves hindering their movement. Flash Sentry took to the air. The sleet made it almost impossible for him to see, as did the wind battering against his wings. He raced into the clouds as fast as he could, attempting to reach above the thrashing blizzard. Magic blasts and obsidian barbs ravaged the ground below as the two combatants tried to gain the advantage. Shining resorted to teleportation as means of agility, the snow too thick to maneuver through. His massive enemy grinned, arrogantly playing his prey while he could.
Where did your friend fly off to? Abandoning his false prince, is he?
He turned his head towards the direction the Pegasus had flown off to. Another thunderclap resonated in the sky, drawing much closer. Shining blinked on top of a flat-topped spire before leaping off towards the alicorn, his sword aimed at his eyes. With a confused expression on his face, the black stallion released a barrage of glass missiles towards his foolishly aggressive opponent. A flash of magic caused Shining to vanish and reappear behind the alicorn. In his brief vantage over the black behemoth, a quick slash of his blade ripped up the alicorn's spine. Thunder continued to crash about the sky as Flash manipulated the overcast around him. Bolts of lightning came into sight as they snaked towards a collective target. A strange and stinging sensation overcame him as the arcs of electricity finally reached him. Wrapping around him like bands of wire, the lightning clung to him with an almighty grasp. One last thunderclap shredded through the clouds. Shining fell to the ground, successful in his strike. Wincing in pain, Sombra never had the chance to see the sudden bolt erupt from the clouds above, striking him instantly. Flash had crashed his hoof into the alicorn's ribs, using the power of the bolt, throwing Sombra with the force of a train. The black stallion's journey through the air was short-lived, as Shining's blade dug into his shoulder. A huge mass of black soot erupted from the wound, blinding the stallions further. After a momentary silence, Sombra's form reappeared behind the two of them, towering over the ponies with uninhibited spite and completely unharmed. His horn billowing smoke like a chimney.
Good try. I think my ribs cracked.
Before either of them could react, a tower of obsidian impaled the Pegasus' left wing. Flash Sentry's scream exploded, louder than the roaring winds around them. Ripping pain spread across his bones as he hung from the injury the spike had created. Shining quickly charged up his horn, blasting away the crystal as Flash fell limply into the snow. He raced over to the Pegasus before a sudden circle of spikes exploded towards them. Shining managed to form a shield in time, with the spikes inches away from his face.
Quick. I don't use you survive.
We've beaten you once, we can do it again.
Shining shouted back. Sombra unleashed a hellish laugh.
What's that? I couldn't hear you over my raging blizzard that's suffocating your land. I couldn't see you as I'm facing my sun. Celestia is dead and Luna imprisoned. There is a time when you will die, either by me or my winter.
Shining grimaced as the obsidian latched onto his shield, growing slightly over it, like vines in ancient ruins.
I won a long time ago, Shining Armor. I won't let you live this time.
Flash groaned as he managed to stand, his body shaking. The dark tendrils continued to expand over Shining's force field, the obsidian promising to envelop them. Shining's horn lost its light as his shield suddenly fell. The black spikes immediately thrust inward, rushing to greet them. His horn reignited as he teleported them both out of their prison. Landing in the frost, Shining spun around. Searing pain shot through his shoulder as he found himself stuck through by another pillar of obsidian. His warm blood was a terrifying contrast to the freezing cold. The unicorn didn't have a chance to scream, as Sombra's eyes sent their vicious messengers into his mind. Flash regained his composure as he tried to charge the preoccupied alicorn. A small spike caught his hoof, slicing it as he fell to the ground. He winced, looking up at Sombra. staring directly into the monster's gaze. The blizzard continued its rampage as silence fell upon the three of them. Standing completely still in the unforgiving snow, Shining and Flash lost themselves in unimaginable horror. Fears they couldn't even imagine consumed their minds as Sombra revelled in their dread. A collection of hooves crunched through the tundra. Sombra's ears perked up as he looked in the direction of the coming forces. For the first time, he damned his own winter, being unable to properly view the approaching party. The only thing he could discern was that there were 6 of them. It Was Silent by Muel. It was silent. Her head felt like an egg after being emptied into a mixing bowl and beaten with a whisk, and her skull felt like the brittle shell was tossed in for good measure. It was dark. She realized her eyes were shut, squinted shut in a desperate attempt to squeeze out the throbbing pain, but also covered by something wrapped around her head. It was cold. The mattress under her back was firm, and the cloth draped over her belly was thin and allowed the cool, dry air to sift through. Her hooves were strapped to the bed. It was silent. Her voice made no noise as she gained the strength to cry out. She felt the wind passing through her, but only the vibrations in her throat grew more intense. It was futile. Her hooves struggled to free themselves from their straps, but whatever bound them was too strong for them to break, and granted no mercy for motion. It was warm. Something soft and round touched her chest, momentarily stopping her struggles. The object lifted away, but another began stroking her neck and her shoulder. It was silent. The stretching of her neck and the rolling of her mane under her head were the only signs that she had turned toward the object which was now against her cheek. It was sharp. Something pricked her and embedded itself into her leg, penetrating deep before pushing a thick fluid inside and removing itself from between her muscles. It was cold. The coverings over her eyes were damp, drawing the heat from her face and sending it out into the air, flowing above her aching head. The pain slowly followed. The carriage ride home bounced her over the roads of Canterlot. Its hard wooden wheels struck the hard stone ground with hardly a jostle to show for it. It was wet. The fur under her eyes glistened in the morning light, but she couldn't bring herself to wipe away the sparkles. The one beside her, however, did that for her. It was warm. Celestia's sun shone through the doorless openings in the carriage's sides. Her alabaster escort reached out and held her in a loving embrace, softly stroking her mane. It was silent. She could see ponies going about their day, conversing with each other, laughing at jokes and smiling at trivialities which could only be enjoyed by the true elites. It was hard. The carriage stopped, and her escort stepped out before extending a hoof to her. She grabbed hold, but she still stumbled on her way out, and was quickly caught. It was cold. The stones under her hooves had yet to accept Celestia's gift of light as she walked toward her apartment building. She reached into her bag and grabbed her key. It was silent. The telling creak of the opening door wasn't present, nor were the creaks of the steps, of the stairs, which led to her room as her weight pressed down on them. It was familiar. After weeks of time in a room filled with ponies she had never met, nor intended ever to meet, her little room was a welcome sight. Yet it still felt incomplete. It was empty. The corner in the back of the room where she kept her most treasured possession was vacant. Where a large, black plastic case should have stood nothing. It was silent. The stage which had welcomed her, where she once performed many recitals and many symphonies, now shunned her, refusing even the soft echo of her hoofsteps. It was dark. A single light shone from above her, illuminating her grey coat and the large cloth covering which she carried, but all else remained shrouded in familiar blackness. It was chestnut. She doffed the covering from her instrument, revealing its large wooden body and long black neck. The pegs in its scroll were ebony, connected to long metal wires. It was silent. She placed her instrument down on its side with a ginger hoof, but the gentle kiss between the floor and instrument passed unnoticed until her hoof left its neck. It was heavy. She drew her bow and tightened its hair before grabbing the small chunk of dark resin. Taut hair and hardened sap met in her hooves, as they had many times before. It was ready. She lifted her instrument and touched their necks together with a lover's embrace, begging against hope that it would return her love. She raised her bow to its string. It was silent. The music she knew and loved did not reach her. She couldn't stop playing, nor could she continue with the song. She poured her entire soul into that one note. It was over. She withdrew her bow and loosened it, before returning it and her instrument's body underneath their black cloth case. She zipped it closed and placed it on her back. It was white. One pony stood at the edge of the light as she turned, a pony who was with her every step of the way, reaching out even now to try and calm her silent tears. It was silent. She felt the wind across her back, ushering a grey wall of clouds with its swift movement. Every Pegasus in the city would be focused on the coming storm. It was distant. The train carrying her closest friend to Ponyville could be seen along the side of the mountain, snaking its way along the cliffs until it disappeared into a tunnel. It was silent. The rain began to pour, beating her face and the rooftop as she stepped onto the edge of the stone. She cast one final look at the tunnel. It was pounding. Her heart raced, unprepared for what she knew she would do. She took several deep breaths to calm herself, before closing her eyes and letting gravity carry her. Then she was silent. It was just before midnight when the girls started for home. She breathed deeply of the cool January air and sighed with abject pleasure as she breathed it out. There was no finer time of year, she reasoned. Let the beachgoers have their summer, the picnickers their spring. Let the leafers have their autumn, and the young have their winter. The first 2 weeks of January were not a season, they were a paradise, particularly for those like the girl who preferred sitting inside. The cold air was nice, but even nicer was the ability to retreat into the warmth of a library or a home whenever one felt like it. She breathed in and out again, this time paying attention as the air fogged from her mouth. When she'd been small, she'd fancied herself a dragon, a blazing inferno barely contained within her breast.
Now she knew the science behind it, the reasoning. She was no dragon, she was just a student. She was no little girl, she was a high schooler. She tugged her jacket closer to her and left the all-night study hall at a smooth, even pace. There was no need to hurry, to rush. She'd spent her entire life cultivating an unbreakable trust with her parents in readiness for nights like these. While her peers would abuse the freedom that came with their age, the girl knew what a wondrous reward trust could give, even if the burden of responsibility was heavy. Her parents' trust in her was the reason they allowed her to walk the mile to the all-night study hall with no threat of breaking curfew. It was why she was given her very own house key at her last birthday party. It was why they had allowed her to tell the boy that, yes, she was available to go and see a movie this Saturday. Thoughts of the boy filled her with warmth, and she hugged the jacket, his jacket, tighter against her. "Look how much he already trusts me," she would tell her small group of friends. "He's already given me his coat to wear." Her pace picked up, her shoes echoing on the empty shop fronts that surrounded her. There was not a single sign of anyone around. No cars on the road, no lights in the windows. She was utterly alone in the night. Her steps faltered at the strangeness. She looked this way and that for some sign, any sign, of human activity. Nothing. Not a single car had driven past her, not even a taxicab. There was not even one other person out enjoying the weather as she was. Her feet came to a stop. The echo of her steps faded. Her ears picked up the slightest of oddities in the air. She listened hard for the sound of the wind blowing between the buildings, for the calls of the crickets in the grass that lined the sidewalk. She listened for the distant sound of someone's bass, of a voice carried on the breeze from down the way. There was nothing. Nothing save for the sound of her own breathing. She started walking for a moment, waiting for the echo to begin again. Once she heard it, she froze in place and listened. The echo faded and stopped, but much later than it should have. If she didn't know any better, she would have guessed that there was someone walking behind her. She spun, her two-toned hair whipping with the force, and cast her eyes back. Standing less than 20 feet away was a figure clad all in black. A black ski mask covered his face. The girl's heart began to beat faster. Adrenaline began to rush through her veins. She tensed to run, grasping the straps of her book bag tighter to ensure the precious cargo would not fall when she did what she was planning to do next. The figure stood still a moment, just watching her. The girl bolted. She heard the figure start running right behind her. She was no athlete. She couldn't even remember the last time she'd run. Her mother had suggested taking track, making a sly remark about how guys tended to like toned legs. As her chest began to burn from the exertion of running, she made a promise to herself, and to whatever powers there were, that she would apologize to her mother for brushing off her suggestion. She heard her pursuer keeping pace behind her. She dared to look back, and gasped. The person chasing her was rapidly gaining ground. His sudden ability to overtake her seemed to be coming from the fact that he was now on all fours, almost galloping straight at her. The girl spun and screamed as she lost her footing and fell backwards. He was upon her a second later, his gloved hands clasping desperately for her throat. She squirmed and pulled away from him with every bit of strength inside her. Her book bag strap broke, and she, thinking quickly, swung it like a club at her assailant's head. The bag was weighed down by some of the heaviest books the library had to offer. The assailant gasped in pain and fell to his side. The book bag split open, spilling books, papers, and pencils onto the sidewalk. The girl paid them no mind. She struggled to her feet and made to run again. "Oh, no, you don't!" The sound of the voice shocked her so much that she was wholly unprepared for what happened next.
her assailant lunged forward and wrapped their arms around her legs. The girl screamed again as her momentum carried her back to the ground. The scream was abruptly silenced as the girl's skull smacked heavily against the cold sidewalk. Suddenly, she didn't feel much like running anymore. She lay there, dazed, as her attacker rolled her over and clambered up her body. The girl stared at the starry night sky, identifying constellations, until her view was erased forever by the masked face of her attacker. The thing in the black ski mask stared directly into her eyes. Her eyes. She was staring into her own eyes. Hands, dainty and thin, even when wrapped in gloves, wrapped around her throat and squeezed.
Nothing personal,
the attacker grunted in a voice that did not belong to her, that could not belong to her. The girl tried to breathe, tried to wrestle at her attacker's wrists, but she was just too weak. Whoever this thing was, it was possessed by some horrible will. Its strength was incredible, its grip ironclad. Concussed and suffocating, knowing that this was her dying moment, the girl felt one last pang of curiosity. She reached out for her attacker's face and used the last of her fading strength to pull the mask away. A cascade of two-toned hair fell around her face. She stared into a mirror as she died. She shook once, twice, then went limp. Taking no chances, the attacker held the grip tight for a few minutes more. To make absolutely sure, since there could be no mistakes, she twisted the girl's neck sharply and tried to suppress her rising gorge as she felt the bones give way. The attacker fell away from the body to recover herself. There, she thought, the hard part was done with. She reached into her pocket and removed a small vial of violet liquid. She stood and examined the body, ensuring that there were no bits of jewelry or other bodily markers that she would need to take with her. A thought occurred to her, and she carefully removed the jacket from the girl's body. She pulled it on and smirked at the perfect fit. There was something in the inner pocket. She reached inside and pulled out 2 small cards. The first read, "Property of Flash Sentry." The second was a school ID, still unbent and nearly new, probably printed less than 6 months ago. It read, "Sunset Shimmer, Canterlot High School, Freshman." A smirk crawled over Sunset Shimmer's lips. She returned the cards to the inner pocket and uncorked the vial.
For what it's worth, I'm sorry it had to be this way, but I've got work to do.
She drizzled the vial's contents over the corpse and watched as the magical flames did their work. Flickering violet light shone in the night for an instant, then faded to nothingness. The body was gone, reduced to less than ashes. Sunset Shimmer inhaled the crisp, cool night air of this new world she had come to, and pulled out the scrap of paper she had pulled from the spellbook just before her escape through the mirror. She relished the tingle of the magic in her hands one last time, before she tore it in half. The night was suddenly alive with cricket song. Taxis drove past, seeking patrons. She hugged her new jacket tighter against her and looked down the road. She figured that she had better get moving. Her new parents would be getting worried. It was just after midnight when the girl started for home. Memento Mori by Pale Horse. Applejack breathed. It was a simple task that had recently become far more difficult. Every breath was slow, ragged, uneven. Sharp bolts of pain shot through her chest when she inhaled, as if her lungs might burst, followed by equally sweet relief when she exhaled. It was a wet, rasping rattle of a noise, and that was when she wasn't having a coughing fit. The bedroom door creaked as it opened and shut. She'd always meant to have Mac fix that blasted thing. Not much point in it now.
Are they gone?
She asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. Not gone, came the answer. Twilight's voice, so unlike her own. Strong, regal, authoritative, like usual. She hadn't always been that way, but that was before she wore a crown. It all seemed so long ago. They were waiting downstairs.
Waiting,
Applejack repeated, dryly.
waiting for me to die.
They're your friends, Applejack. There was no amusement in Twilight's voice.
I know.
Applejack sighed.
Best I could ever ask for. Just don't seem right, standing around, waiting for the end to come. Should be off doing something more important.
Nothing is more important than this. Twilight's tone was gently chiding.
Says you.
If she had had the strength, Applejack might have felt like arguing the point. But she didn't. So instead, she laid her head back upon her pillow, lifting her eyes to the ceiling and staring at nothing.
Do they know what it is?
Yes. Twilight moved closer to the bedside. Applejack could hear her wings rustling in the darkness and the clump of her hooves upon the floor as she moved. Cancer, just as we thought.
And I thought an apple a day would always keep me healthy.
It left her lips in another burst of fitful coughing, leaving her hunched over the edge of the bed. She heard Twilight approaching and held up a hoof to ward off the princess. When she had sufficiently recovered, she slumped back into the bed, gasping for breath. She didn't feel feverish, but her hair was damp with sweat.
Anything we can do?
Twilight shook her head.
No. I'm sorry. It's too advanced for surgery.
Applejack nodded weakly.
What about magic?
The procedure is very delicate, Twilight said. We can't just wish it out of you. The tumors have to be removed carefully, one at a time, or else we'd risk accidentally teleporting out one of your organs, like your heart or your stomach. It requires a great deal of precision. Too much for unicorn magic.
Applejack regarded the ceiling of the bedroom with a kind of fascination. White was such a boring colour. Rarity wouldn't like to hear that, she was sure, but it was true. She remembered hearing somewhere that it wasn't even a real colour anyway. If she had the time, she would paint it a more interesting colour. Red, maybe, like apples.
But not for alicorn magic.
Twilight was silent.
No,
she replied after a moment.
not for alicorn magic.
Applejack gave another wry chuckle. This time, at least, she managed to avoid coughing her lungs out.
I won't let you do it,
she said.
I beg them, Applejack.
She could hear the emotion creeping into Twilight's voice. It was unusual, coming from one who tried so hard to be disciplined.
I swear to you, I threw off my crown and begged them on my hooves. They refused outright.
Applejack smiled faintly. That certainly sounded like her luck.
Did they say why?
She asked. Some garbage about not interfering in the natural course of events, Twilight groused. If it was an illness we knew how to treat, they'd just give you medicine. But since it isn't, they choose to do nothing. What good is having the power of an alicorn if you aren't going to use it to help any pony?
Okay, Sugar Cube,
Applejack sighed.
Like Granny Smith used to say, horse apples happen. I guess she was right.
She was unable to keep herself from laughing, and that was a mistake. The sensation caused her to bolt upright in bed, hacking and coughing violently. She pressed a foreleg against her mouth in an attempt to stifle the sound, and felt one of Twilight's wings pressing against her back. After a long moment, she straightened her posture, looking down at her foreleg. There was fresh blood upon her hoof. Applejack turned her gaze to her friend. Judging by her expression, Applejack supposed that she must have looked even worse than she felt, if that was possible.
How long?
She whispered. Twilight frowned. It varies from one pony to the next, but given your condition, I think it'll happen tonight.
Good,
Applejack muttered.
No sense in drawing it out. I'm tired. I'm tired of feeling weak. I'm not used to it.
She leaned back against the head of her bed with another sigh, drawing in a deep breath and then letting it back out again. It was the first one she had taken in a long time that didn't hurt.
You know, Twilight, it's funny. After all we've been through, I always thought it'd be a changeling invasion, or a dragon attack, or the sky falling, or whatever the bug else that'll do me in. I have to admit, I never thought it'd end like this.
It doesn't have to.
Both Twilight and Applejack abruptly turned to face the new speaker. Neither of them had even heard the window open. Fluttershy hovered outside it, her leathery wings beating in the cool night air.
Hello, girls.
Fluttershy continued, her crimson eyes glowing in the darkness.
May I come in?
You're always welcome here, Sugar Cube,
Applejack said.
You know that.
Fluttershy smiled warmly, a gesture that exposed her gleaming fangs.
Sorry, old habits die hard.
The bat pony glided in through the window, alighting upon the floor without a sound. She drew up to the bed opposite Twilight, looking down upon the orange mare.
You are looking well.
Can't lie to honesty, darling,
Applejack mused.
I was starting to wonder if you'd show up. We missed you.
Well, I would have been here sooner,
Fluttershy said, lifting her scarlet eyes to Twilight.
but I wasn't entirely sure if I'd be wanted.
Twilight scowled. I never said that you couldn't be here.
No, but you didn't invite me either.
Applejack lifted a hoof.
No fighting, girls. My house, my rules.
Twilight had been preparing to offer a retort, but at Applejack's prodding she fell silent, although her scowl deepened. Fluttershy merely nodded.
No fighting,
She agreed.
Do you know why I'm here?
To see me off into the great beyond, I imagine. Same as every pony else.
The bat pony canted her head to one side.
Not if you don't want to go.
Applejack narrowed her eyes.
What do you mean?
Fluttershy bowed her head forward. The soft strands of her long pink mane made a whisper of sound as they pulled upon the bedsheets.
I am here to offer an alternative.
No, Twilight snorted. Absolutely not. Fluttershy turned toward Twilight once more.
It is her choice to make, not yours.
Twilight grimaced. The other princesses do not approve of that. And for the record, neither do I. Fluttershy sneered, exposing her fangs once more.
Says the immortal,
She snapped.
When was the last time any of them had to stare the Grim Horseman in the face? When did you?
No fighting,
Applejack whispered. Silence fell once more. She turned towards the bat pony.
What choice?
Fluttershy paused. Applejack could see that she was considering her words carefully.
You can become like me,
She said.
No more sickness, no more pain. only strength and vitality, and a kind of freedom that you've never known.
Applejack nodded slowly, then turned to face the princess.
It's Twilight.
Twilight bit her lip.
It's unnatural, Applejack. You'd be substituting one disease for another.
It is not a disease,
Fluttershy hissed.
I am still the element of kindness. Have I ever once failed in my obligations to you or to Equestria?
Twilight grit her teeth together. No, she growled.
Then let me save our friend,
Fluttershy replied, her tone softening.
please.
Twilight squeezed her eyes shut. She was trembling upon her hooves, whether with grief or some other emotion, Applejack could not tell. After a time, her eyes opened again.
As she said, Applejack,
Twilight whispered.
it is your choice.
Applejack turned to Fluttershy. She hesitated for a moment, and then nodded. Fluttershy nodded in turn, and bowed her head closer. Her breath was warm upon Applejack's face. Applejack lifted a hoof as best she could manage, giving the bat pony pause.
What'll I tell my family?
Tell them the truth.
The bat pony murmured in reply.
Tell them that you chose life over death.
Fluttershy tenderly nuzzled Applejack's neck and bit her.